My Uber driver recognized me from a missing persons poster, but I've never been reported missing. The driver's eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror, and I pretended not to notice while my stomach twisted into knots. We were stopped at a red light on Belmore Avenue when he finally spoke, his voice careful and measured like he was approaching a wild animal. I don't want to freak you out, but I think I've seen your face before. My hands went cold against my phone screen, and I forced myself to look up and meet his gaze in the mirror. His expression wasn't threatening, just confused and concerned, which somehow made it worse. On a missing persons flyer, he continued, and the words felt like ice water dumping over my head. At the gas station on Route 9, your picture was right there by the register. I told him he must be mistaken because I'd never been reported missing, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, considering my heart was trying to punch through my ribs. He shook his head slowly and pulled out his phone at the next light, scrolling through his photos until he found what he was looking for. The image he showed me made my vision swim because it was definitely my face staring back from a grainy printout, the word missing in bold letters across the top. The photo looked like it was taken maybe 2 years ago based on my hair length, and underneath my picture was information I'd never seen before. Name, Alexis Moreau, age, 19, last seen, March 15th, 2023. My actual name is Alexis Moreau, and I was 19, but I'd never been missing on March 15th or any other date. The driver's name was David according to the app, and he kept glancing between me and his phone like he was trying to solve a puzzle that didn't have all its pieces. He asked if I was safe, if I needed help, and his genuine concern made this whole situation feel more real and terrifying. I told him I lived with my mom in an apartment on the north side and had no idea why someone would report me missing. David suggested we drive to the gas station so I could see the flyer myself, and something in his voice made me agree even though every instinct screamed this was a terrible idea. We changed the destination in the app and headed toward Route 9, and I texted my mom asking if she'd ever filed a missing persons report on me, knowing the answer would be no but needing to confirm my sanity. Mom responded within seconds saying she had no idea what I was talking about and demanding to know why I was asking such a strange question. I screenshot David's photo of the flyer and sent it to her, watching the typing indicator appear and disappear 3 times before she finally responded. Her message just said, "Call me now," in all caps, which wasn't like her at all because she usually stayed calm during emergencies. I told David I needed to make a call and he nodded, turning down his radio while I dialed. Mom answered before the first ring finished, her voice tight with something I couldn't identify but that made my skin crawl. "Where did you see that flyer?" she demanded, and I explained about the Uber driver and the gas station. The silence that followed lasted too long, and when she spoke again, her words came out carefully measured. "Stay in that Uber. Don't go to the gas station. Come home right now and don't talk to anyone." David heard enough of the conversation to pick up on the tension, and when I asked him to take me home instead, he didn't argue. The drive back felt like it took hours, even though it was only 15 minutes, and I spent the whole time staring at that photo on his phone which I'd asked him to send me. The flyer listed a phone number to call with information, and my fingers hovered over it a dozen times before I finally worked up the courage to dial. A woman answered on the 3rd ring, her voice professional but warm, identifying herself as Detective Lauren Vasquez with the state police. I told her my name was Alexis Moreau, and I was calling about a missing persons flyer with my face on it, and the pause that followed felt like falling through empty space. Detective Vasquez asked where I was calling from and whether I was safe, her tone shifting into something more intense and focused. I explained I was in an Uber heading home and had never been reported missing by anyone I knew. She started asking rapid-fire questions about my date of birth, my address, my mother's name, and with each answer I gave her responses got quieter and more clipped. Finally, she told me not to hang up, and I heard her speaking to someone else in the background, words like active case and welfare check filtering through. When she came back on the line, her voice had changed completely. "Alexis, I need you to listen very carefully. That flyer was filed by your father, Gregory Moreau, on March 15th, 2023. He reported you missing from your shared residence in Clifton Heights. My father died when I was 6 years old in a car accident on the interstate, and I said this out loud before my brain could fully process the implications." Detective Vasquez went completely silent, and I could hear papers rustling and keyboard clicks through the phone. She asked me to repeat what I'd just said, so I did, adding that my mom raised me alone after his death, and we'd never lived in Clifton Heights. The detective's breathing changed, became faster and shallower, and when she spoke again, her words were measured and careful, like she was diffusing a bomb. "Alexis, I'm going to ask you something important, and I need you to be completely honest. Has your mother ever told you anything about your father that seemed inconsistent or strange?" The question felt like a trapdoor opening under my feet because, yes, Mom's stories about Dad had always been vague and shifted depending on when she told them. David pulled up to my apartment building and I thanked him, still on the phone with Detective Vasquez, who was insisting I wait for a patrol car before going inside. I told her Mom was expecting me and I'd be fine, but she raised her voice for the first time, stating firmly that I needed to wait in the Uber until officers arrived. Something in her tone made David's eyes widen, and he locked the doors without me asking, meeting my gaze in the mirror with an expression that said he was starting to understand. This was bigger than a simple misunderstanding. The detective asked David to stay with me and confirmed his identity through the Uber app, before explaining that patrol units were approximately 8 minutes away. Those 8 minutes felt like 8 hours as I watched my apartment building's entrance, half expecting Mom to come running out. Detective Vasquez kept me on the line, asking seemingly random questions about my childhood, my memories, where I went to school. She wanted to know if I had a birth certificate or social security card, and when I said yes, she asked me to describe them. I told her about the documents in our fire safe, standard government-issued papers with official seals, and she made a sound that might have been a sigh or a curse. "Alexis, I've been working your case for 18 months, she said quietly. Your father has been looking for you since you were 17. He's filed reports in 6 different states, hired private investigators, and posted on every missing persons database in the country. According to his records, your mother abducted you during a custody exchange when you were 6 years old, and you've been missing ever since." The world tilted sideways and my phone nearly slipped from my suddenly numb fingers because that couldn't be true. Mom wouldn't do that, couldn't do that, and I had memories of Dad's funeral complete with a casket and flowers and relatives I hadn't seen since. Detective Vasquez's voice cut through my spiraling thoughts, asking if I remembered the funeral clearly or if it was more like remembering a story someone told me. The question hit like a physical blow because when I really tried to recall specific details, everything went fuzzy and vague. I remembered standing in a black dress but couldn't picture the church or cemetery. I remembered relatives hugging me but couldn't name them or describe their faces. I remembered crying but couldn't remember why it felt necessary beyond knowing it was expected. 2 patrol cars pulled up with their lights off, and officers approached the Uber with their hands visible and non-threatening. Detective Vasquez told me to put her on speaker, and one of the officers, a woman named Officer Chen, verified the detective's identity before asking me to step out of the vehicle. My legs felt like water as I stood, and David gave me an encouraging nod before driving away, his fare probably long forgotten in the face of whatever crisis he'd accidentally uncovered. Officer Chen was maybe 40 with kind eyes and a firm handshake, and she asked if my mother was home while her partner, Officer Walsh, spoke quietly into his radio. I said I thought so and showed them which apartment was ours. 3rd floor, corner unit, the one with the blue curtains Mom had hung last spring. Detective Vasquez stayed on speakerphone as Officer Chen asked for permission to accompany me inside, and I said yes because I couldn't imagine facing Mom alone with this information burning holes in my brain. We climbed the stairs together, and I felt like I was moving through a dream. Everything slightly unreal and disconnected. My key turned in the lock and the door swung open on our familiar living room with its mismatched furniture and the bookshelf Mom had built from reclaimed wood. She came around the corner from the kitchen and stopped dead when she saw the officers, her face going through a rapid series of expressions I couldn't fully read. Fear was definitely there, and something else that looked like resignation, or maybe relief. Mom's eyes found mine and held them. And in that moment, I saw everything I needed to know written in her expression. The guilt, the love, the desperation, all tangled together into something that made my chest ache. "Alexis," she said softly, and her voice cracked on my name. Officer Chen stepped slightly in front of me, a protective gesture that felt both insulting and necessary, while Officer Walsh positioned himself by the door. Detective Vasquez's voice came through my phone, calm and professional, asking my mother to identify herself. Mom's shoulders dropped and she sank onto the couch like a puppet with cut strings, her hands shaking as she pressed them to her face. "My name is Nicole Moreau," she said, the words muffled. "And I took my daughter 13 years ago because her father was going to kill us both." The apartment fell into silence so complete I could hear the clock ticking in the kitchen, and Officer Chen's hand moved closer to her weapon. Detective Vasquez asked Mom to explain what she meant, her tone neutral but sharp, and Mom looked up with tears streaming down her face. She started talking, and the story that came out shattered every foundation I thought I'd built my life on. Dad wasn't dead. He was alive and living in Clifton Heights, and he'd been searching for me since Mom fled with me during what was supposed to be a supervised visit. The car accident that supposedly killed him never happened. The funeral I remembered had been fabricated, a psychological manipulation Mom used to help me accept his absence and stop asking questions. Mom described years of escalating abuse, violence that left her with broken ribs and a shattered orbital bone, threats that grew more specific and terrifying as I got older. She said Dad became obsessed with control, monitoring her every movement, isolating her from friends and family. She explained how he'd started making comments about me, about my body developing, about keeping me pure and protected from outside influences. The way she described it made my skin crawl, and Officer Chen's expression hardened with professional recognition of a pattern she'd clearly seen before. Mom said she'd tried going through legal channels, filing for divorce, requesting protection orders, but Dad's family had money and connections. His lawyer was a partner at a major firm, and somehow every filing Mom made got lost or dismissed or delayed indefinitely. The breaking point came when Mom found a list in Dad's office, names and addresses of remote properties he'd been researching, places far from civilization with no neighbors. She found architectural drawings for modifications to a basement, locks on the outside of doors, soundproofing materials. She found journals describing his plans to homeschool me completely, cut me off from all outside contact, mold me into his vision of perfection. The terror in her voice as she described finding those documents felt viscerally real, and I found myself believing her even though this contradicted everything I thought I knew. Detective Vasquez asked why Mom didn't take the evidence to police, and Mom laughed, a bitter sound without humor. She had taken it to police, had filed reports with 3 different departments, but Dad reported the documents stolen and claimed Mom fabricated the threatening content. Mom described the custody exchange that became our escape, how she'd been planning for months, saving cash from her part-time job, establishing a new identity through channels she wouldn't specify. She'd packed a bag with essentials and hidden it in a storage unit, arranged for a friend to wait 3 states away with a car that couldn't be traced to her. During the supervised visit at a park, she'd seen Dad watching me with an expression that made her decision absolute and immediate. She grabbed my hand and ran, leaving behind our entire lives, everyone we knew, every possession except what fit in that hidden bag. We'd been running ever since, moving every few years when Mom got nervous, changing our appearances slightly, living quiet, invisible lives that left no paper trails. Officer Walsh asked about the fake documents, the birth certificate and social security card I'd described. Mom admitted she'd purchased them from someone she'd met online, paying cash and never asking questions about how they were created. She knew it was illegal, knew it made her a criminal, but she believed it was the only way to keep me safe and give me some semblance of a normal life. She'd enrolled me in school under my real first name but her maiden last name, let me make friends and join clubs, tried to balance safety with normalcy even though the fear never left. Every time someone knocked on the door unexpectedly, every time a stranger looked at me too long, Mom's panic would spike, and she'd start planning our next move. Detective Vasquez's voice cut through Mom's story, asking pointed questions about evidence and verification. She wanted to know if Mom had kept any of the original documents from Dad's office, any photos of her injuries, any witnesses who could corroborate her claims. Mom shook her head and explained she'd left everything behind in the escape, couldn't risk carrying evidence that might identify us if we got caught. Her injuries had healed years ago, and the friends who might have testified were people she could never contact without risking our location. Detective Vasquez went quiet, and I could practically hear her weighing the situation, trying to determine if she was listening to a protective mother or a master manipulator. I asked Mom why she'd created the fake funeral memory, and my voice came out smaller than I intended. She looked at me with such raw pain that I almost told her not to answer, but I needed to know. She explained that I'd cried for Dad constantly those first few months, had asked when we were going home, when I could see him again. She'd tried explaining that we couldn't go back, but at 6 years old I couldn't understand the complexity or danger. So she'd created a story I could understand, told me Dad died in an accident, described a funeral in enough detail that my child's brain eventually constructed a memory around her narrative. She'd shown me forged obituaries and newspaper clippings, staged photos she'd manipulated to show a casket and mourners. She'd done it to protect me from the truth and give me closure, and the guilt had eaten at her every single day since. Officer Chen spoke quietly into her radio, updating someone on the situation, and I heard dispatcher codes I didn't understand. Detective Vasquez said she needed to verify Mom's claims before determining next steps, and her tone suggested this was far more complicated than a simple custodial interference case. She asked Mom for the names of the police departments where she'd filed reports about Dad's threats, the name of his lawyer, any specific details that could be corroborated through official records. Mom provided information haltingly, admitting she couldn't remember everything after 13 years of deliberately trying to forget. She knew Dad's lawyer was named Sullivan at the firm of Sullivan and Crane, and she thought she'd filed reports with Clifton Heights PD and state police. Detective Vasquez said she'd need several hours to pull records and verify information, and in the meantime, Mom would need to come to the station for a formal statement. Officer Chen explained this wasn't an arrest, but Mom would be detained pending investigation, and she had the right to an attorney. Mom nodded like she'd been expecting this, and when she stood to get her purse, her movements were slow and defeated. She looked at me and asked if I believed her, and the question hung in the air between us, loaded with 13 years of lies and love and desperation. I said I didn't know what I believed anymore, but I needed to understand what was real and what wasn't. She nodded and her face crumpled, but she didn't break down, just straightened her shoulders and walked toward the door. Before the officers could escort her out, I asked Mom one more question that had been burning in my mind. If Dad was so dangerous, why hadn't he found us in 13 years? We'd lived relatively normal lives. I'd been enrolled in schools. We had a lease on this apartment in our names. Mom's expression turned hard, her jaw clenching. She explained we'd never lived anywhere more than 18 months, never used credit cards or bank accounts in our real names, never went to doctors or dentists who kept records. The apartment lease was under a friend's name, someone Mom had met who let her pay cash without questions. My school enrollment used fake documents and a fake address. Every aspect of our lives had been carefully constructed to leave no trail, and it had worked until I'd called a number on a missing persons flyer and made myself visible. After the officers left with Mom, I stood alone in our apartment surrounded by 13 years of carefully constructed lies. Detective Vasquez stayed on the phone, her voice gentler now, explaining that I could stay here for tonight but would need to come to the station tomorrow for my own statement. She said a victim's advocate would be assigned to help me navigate whatever came next, whether that meant reunification with my father or supporting Mom's claims of abuse. The word reunification made my stomach turn because I couldn't reconcile the idea of a father who loved me with the monster Mom had described. I'd lived 19 years believing he was dead, mourning someone who never died, and now I was supposed to potentially meet him like nothing had happened. I called my best friend Zara, who I'd known since we moved to this neighborhood 3 years ago, and when she answered, I immediately started crying. The whole story came pouring out in fractured sentences while she listened in stunned silence. When I finished, she asked what I needed, and I loved her for not demanding explanations or expressing judgment. I said I needed to not be alone, so she showed up 20 minutes later with takeout food I couldn't eat and her presence, which was the only thing keeping me from completely falling apart. We sat on the couch where Mom had confessed everything, and Zara held my hand while I tried to process that my entire identity might be a construction built on trauma and deception. Zara suggested searching for my father online, and my hands shook as I typed Gregory Moreau into Google. The results loaded, and there he was, dozens of photos and articles spanning years. He looked like me, or I looked like him. Same dark hair and sharp jawline and green eyes. The photos showed him at charity events, business functions, family gatherings with people who might be my grandparents or aunts or uncles I'd never known existed. Recent articles described his tireless search for his missing daughter, interviews where he spoke about never giving up hope, reward money offered for information. He looked like a devoted father destroyed by loss, nothing like the abusive monster Mom had painted. But Zara, who was studying psychology and had done research on domestic violence, pointed out that abusers often appeared charming and sympathetic to outsiders. She pulled up statistics about how frequently family courts failed to protect abuse victims, how men with money and status could manipulate systems, how women who fled were often painted as vindictive and unstable. She wasn't saying Mom was definitely telling the truth, but she was saying I shouldn't assume she was lying just because Dad looked respectable in photographs. The uncertainty was suffocating, not knowing who to trust or what to believe, caught between two competing narratives with no way to verify either. That night, I barely slept, lying in my bed staring at the ceiling while my mind spun through every memory trying to determine what was real. I remembered Mom reading to me when I was young, her voice gentle and patient. I remembered her working multiple jobs to keep us fed, coming home exhausted but always having time for homework help. I remembered her tucking me in and checking the locks twice, 3 times, a ritual I'd thought was just quirky but now understood as vigilance. But I also remembered the moves, the sudden departures, the times Mom had pulled me out of school mid-year with vague explanations about better opportunities elsewhere. I remembered her paranoia about privacy, about not posting photos online, about being careful what I told people. Had that been protection or isolation? The next morning, Detective Vasquez called and asked me to come to the station around noon, and her tone was different, sharper, and more focused. When I arrived with Zara, who insisted on accompanying me, the detective's expression was grim. She led us to a conference room where files and documents covered the table, and she gestured for me to sit before launching into what she'd discovered overnight. The records supported key elements of Mom's story, but contradicted others in ways that complicated everything. She'd found police reports filed by Mom in 2010 and 2011, documenting injuries and threats. Photos showed bruising on her face and arms. Medical records confirmed a broken bone. Witness statements from neighbors described hearing arguments. But Detective Vasquez also found counterclaims filed by Dad, accusations that Mom was unstable and violent toward him, his own medical records showing scratches and bruises he claimed she'd inflicted. His lawyer had submitted psychiatric evaluations questioning Mom's mental fitness, documenting erratic behavior and paranoid delusions about threats that couldn't be substantiated. The custody case had been contentious and ugly, with both sides making serious allegations. The detective explained this wasn't unusual in high-conflict divorces, especially those involving domestic violence, where determining the truth became nearly impossible because abusers often flipped the script and claimed they were the real victims. What Detective Vasquez had also discovered was more disturbing than simple he-said-she-said allegations. Dad's lawyer, Richard Sullivan, had been disbarred 5 years ago for witness tampering and evidence fabrication in an unrelated case. 2 of the psychiatric experts who'd evaluated Mom had their licenses suspended for writing biased reports that favored whoever paid them. The judge who'd overseen the custody case had been removed from the bench for accepting bribes. The entire legal proceeding that had tried to determine my fate had been corrupted by money and influence, exactly as Mom had claimed. But that didn't prove Dad was dangerous, only that the system trying to evaluate him had been broken. Detective Vasquez laid out options in her careful, measured way. She could arrest Mom for custodial interference, kidnapping, and identity fraud, charges that carried serious prison time. She could facilitate contact between me and Dad, who had legal rights as my father even though I was now an adult. Or she could continue investigating the abuse claims, try to build a case 13 years after the fact, knowing that evidence had degraded and witnesses had scattered. What she couldn't do was make this decision for me. I was 19, legally an adult, and ultimately I had to choose whether I wanted to pursue a relationship with my father or stand by my mother despite her crimes. I asked Detective Vasquez what her professional opinion was, what she believed after reviewing all the evidence. She was quiet for a long moment before admitting she'd worked cases where mothers fabricated abuse claims to justify parental alienation, and she'd worked cases where fathers convinced systems they were victims while actively terrorizing their families. The documentation here could support either narrative depending on how you interpreted it. Mom's injuries were real but could have been self-defense. Dad's wealth and connections were suspicious but not proof of malice. The corrupt legal officials were damning but had also worked hundreds of other cases, not just ours. Detective Vasquez said the only way to know the truth would be time and observation, watching how everyone behaved when the immediate crisis settled. That afternoon, I met with a victim's advocate named Patricia Williams, who specialized in family abduction cases. She was maybe 60, with gray hair and eyes that had seen everything, and she spoke to me like an equal rather than a victim. She explained that children of parental abduction often struggled with loyalty conflicts and identity confusion, feelings I was definitely experiencing. She said there was no timeline for processing this, no right way to feel, and whatever I decided about my relationships with both parents would be valid. She also warned that Dad would likely want immediate contact now that I'd been found, and I needed to prepare myself for that inevitability. Dad called Detective Vasquez's office that evening, having been notified about the case developments. The detective asked if I wanted to speak with him, and my mouth went dry at the question. After several seconds of silence, I nodded, and she transferred the call to a monitored line in the conference room where I sat with Patricia for support. The phone rang twice before he answered, and his voice was deep and warm when he said my name. Alexis. Oh my God, Alexis. He started crying, these deep shaking sobs that sounded like they came from somewhere primal, and part of me wanted to comfort him while another part stayed frozen and distant. He said he'd been searching for 13 years, never stopped believing I was alive, spent everything he had hiring investigators and filing reports. I told him I didn't know what to say, and my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. He asked if I was okay, if Mom had hurt me, if I needed anything, the questions tumbling over each other with desperate urgency. I said I was physically fine, and he exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for years. He wanted to see me, meet me, hug me, make up for all the lost time. He wanted to explain his side of what happened, show me evidence that Mom had lied. He wanted me to come home to Clifton Heights, meet my grandparents who'd grieved my loss, see my childhood bedroom he'd kept exactly as I'd left it. The intensity of his need pressed against me through the phone, suffocating and overwhelming. I told him I needed time, and the silence that followed felt heavy with his disappointment. He asked how much time, a week, a month, and I said I didn't know. Patricia nodded encouragingly, silently supporting my boundary. Dad's tone changed slightly, became more measured and controlled, and he said he understood but hoped I'd reconsider soon. He mentioned that he'd spoken with his lawyer about Mom's criminal charges, and depending on how cooperative she was, he might be willing to request leniency. The implication was clear. My relationship with him could impact Mom's legal consequences. The manipulation was subtle but present, and I felt anger spark in my chest at the pressure. After hanging up, Patricia told me the attempted guilt trip was a red flag, but not definitive proof of abuse. Some parents genuinely didn't understand appropriate boundaries and used emotional leverage without recognizing it as manipulation. Others weaponized relationships deliberately and systematically. She suggested I consider meeting Dad in a controlled environment with witnesses, seeing how he behaved when he couldn't script the interaction. She also suggested individual therapy to process everything, and I agreed immediately because my brain felt like it was fracturing under the weight of competing truths. Mom was released on bail the next day, her charges pending further investigation. She came home looking smaller and older, her eyes red from crying. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, and the distance between us felt infinite despite being only a few feet. She asked if I'd spoken with Dad, and when I said yes, her face crumpled. She wanted to know what he'd said, how he'd sounded, and I described the conversation as neutrally as possible. Mom's hands clenched into fists, and she said I shouldn't trust anything he told me, that he was probably already strategizing how to isolate me and control me like he'd done to her. The certainty in her voice bothered me because it left no room for alternate possibilities. I told Mom I needed space to figure out what I believed, and that meant spending less time with her temporarily. Her face went white and she reached for my hand, but I pulled back before she could touch me. She asked if I blamed her for lying about Dad, and I said yes, partially, because regardless of her reasons, she'd stolen 13 years of potential relationship with an entire side of my family. She'd made choices that affected my life without giving me any agency, and now I was left trying to piece together an identity from fragments and lies. Mom started crying and apologizing, but her apologies felt hollow because what was done couldn't be undone. Zara offered to let me stay with her family temporarily, and I accepted gratefully, packing a bag while Mom watched from the hallway. She looked broken standing there, and part of me wanted to comfort her, but I couldn't separate my love for her from my anger at her deception. I told her I'd be in touch when I was ready, and she nodded without arguing. As I walked out, she called my name and said one final thing. If you meet him, don't go anywhere alone with him. Promise me that. The fear in her voice was palpable and real, and whether that fear was justified or delusional, I couldn't yet determine. Living with Zara's family gave me breathing room to think without Mom's presence clouding my judgment. Her parents were kind and asked minimal questions, giving me space while making sure I ate and slept. I spent hours researching parental abduction, domestic violence, family court corruption, trying to educate myself on the systems that had failed my family. The more I read, the more I understood that the truth was probably messy and complicated, not the clear hero and villain narrative either parent wanted me to believe. People could be both protective and controlling, both victims and perpetrators, both truthful and deceptive depending on circumstance. Dad started sending emails through Detective Vasquez, carefully worded messages that expressed love and longing without crossing into manipulation. He sent photos of my childhood, birthday parties I barely remembered, holidays we'd celebrated. He sent pictures of extended family asking about me, sending their love. He included medical records showing he'd been in therapy since I disappeared, working on anger management and communication skills. He admitted he hadn't been a perfect husband or father, acknowledged that he and Mom had a toxic relationship, but insisted he'd never been physically violent and would never have hurt me. The emails painted a picture of a flawed man who'd lost everything and spent 13 years trying to get his daughter back. After 2 weeks of research and therapy and sleepless nights, I agreed to meet Dad in a supervised setting. Detective Vasquez arranged for us to meet at her office with Patricia present as neutral support. The morning of the meeting, I threw up twice from nerves, and Zara held my hair back while I heaved into the toilet. She asked if I was sure about this, and I said no, but I was doing it anyway because not knowing felt worse than potential disappointment. She drove me to the station and waited in the lobby while I went upstairs to face the father I'd mourned for 13 years who'd never actually died. Dad was already in the conference room when I arrived, sitting stiffly in a chair with his hands folded on the table. He looked older than his photos, gray threading through his dark hair, lines etched deep around his eyes. When he saw me, he stood abruptly and his face transformed, tears streaming down his cheeks. He took one step forward before stopping himself, visibly restraining the urge to grab me. "You look so much like your grandmother," he said, his voice thick. "She died 4 years ago, still believing she'd see you again." The words hit harder than expected, because they represented another loss caused by Mom's choices, another person I'd never known who'd loved me from a distance. We sat across from each other while Patricia facilitated, asking basic questions to ease the tension. Dad answered carefully, telling me about his business importing specialty furniture, about the house in Clifton Heights he'd bought hoping I'd return someday, about my half-siblings from his second marriage who knew about me and wanted to meet me. He asked about my life, what I studied, what I liked, and I gave vague answers that revealed little. The conversation felt surreal and awkward, two strangers trying to find connection across a chasm of lost time and competing narratives. He didn't match Mom's description of a violent monster, but he also didn't feel warm or immediately trustworthy. Toward the end of the meeting, Patricia stepped out to take a call, leaving us alone for the first time. The shift in Dad's demeanor was subtle but noticeable, his shoulders relaxing and his expression hardening slightly. He asked if Mom had been filling my head with lies about him, and when I said she'd told me her version of events, his jaw clenched. He said she'd always been unstable and paranoid, seeing threats that didn't exist, accusing him of things he never did. He described her as manipulative and vindictive, willing to destroy their family rather than accept shared custody. The bitterness in his tone felt wrong, too intense for someone who claimed to have moved past the relationship. I pointed out that police reports documented Mom's injuries, and Dad's expression shifted into something I couldn't read. He said she'd injured herself or fabricated evidence, that she'd been obsessed with painting him as abusive to win full custody. He claimed the corrupt officials had actually been working for her, not against her, accepting bribes from her lawyer to support her false allegations. His version contradicted everything Detective Vasquez had told me about the case, and the ease with which he reconstructed reality was unsettling. When Patricia returned, Dad's demeanor shifted back immediately, warm and careful, like he'd been wearing a mask that had slipped briefly. After the meeting ended and Dad left, Patricia asked what I'd observed while she was out of the room. I described the conversation and Dad's change in tone, and she nodded thoughtfully. She said abusers often tested boundaries in moments of privacy, using those opportunities to establish control or undermine the other parent. But she also noted that bitter divorced parents often spoke poorly of their exes regardless of abuse, letting years of resentment poison their perspective. The ambiguity was maddening because I wanted clear answers that didn't exist. Over the following weeks, I met with Dad several more times, always in supervised settings with witnesses present. He brought gifts I didn't want, told stories about my early childhood I couldn't verify, pushed gently for more private interactions. Each meeting left me feeling drained and confused because he seemed genuinely loving while simultaneously setting off alarm bells I couldn't fully articulate. He never explicitly pressured me but created subtle obligations through expensive presence and emotional vulnerability. He mentioned how much money he'd spent searching for me, how many sacrifices he'd made, how difficult it had been. The unspoken expectation that I owed him something for his suffering pressed against me constantly. Mom kept her distance like I'd asked, but she sent emails I mostly didn't read. The few I opened were apologetic and desperate, begging me to be careful around Dad, listing warning signs to watch for. Her certainty that he was dangerous felt increasingly like paranoid obsession, but I couldn't fully dismiss her concerns either. I was caught between two parents who'd both harmed me in different ways, one through deception and one through potential threat, and I couldn't trust either of them completely. The breakthrough came unexpectedly when Dad's second wife, Catherine, reached out through Detective Vasquez requesting to speak with me privately. The detective strongly encouraged the meeting, suggesting Catherine might provide valuable perspective. We met at a coffee shop with Patricia present, and Catherine looked nervous and determined in equal measure. She was younger than Dad by maybe 10 years, professionally dressed with kind eyes and hands that wouldn't stop fidgeting. She started by saying she'd wanted to contact me for months, but Dad had forbidden it, and she was risking her marriage by being here. Catherine described her relationship with Dad as progressively isolating and controlling over the 8 years they'd been married. He monitored her phone and email, restricted her access to money, criticized her constantly in ways that eroded her self-worth. He'd never hit her physically, but had thrown objects near her head, punched walls beside her face, created atmosphere of fear through implied threats rather than explicit violence. She said his anger was explosive and unpredictable, triggered by perceived slights or challenges to his authority. She'd tried leaving twice, and both times he'd convinced her she was overreacting, that she was mentally unstable, that no one would believe her claims. She'd stayed because of their children, 2 boys aged 6 and 4 who adored their father and showed no signs of abuse. Dad treated his sons completely differently than he treated Catherine, warm and patient with them while being cold and demanding with her. She'd started documenting incidents after the second time she tried to leave, keeping a hidden journal and taking photos of damaged property. She brought copies to show me, pages describing incidents that echoed Mom's stories with eerie similarity. She said she believed Mom's allegations completely because she was living a version of the same nightmare, and she was terrified of what might happen if Dad got unsupervised access to me. I asked Catherine why she was telling me this now, risking her safety and her marriage. She said her oldest son had started showing signs of anxiety, becoming hypervigilant about Dad's moods, and she recognized the early stages of trauma she'd watched me experience through Dad's obsessive stories about finding me. She said Dad talked about me constantly, about reclaiming his daughter, about teaching me to respect him properly. The way he described our future relationship made Catherine uncomfortable, because it focused on obedience and gratitude rather than genuine connection. She believed he saw me as property to reclaim rather than a person with autonomy, and she couldn't stay silent knowing I was walking into potential danger. Catherine provided contact information for Dad's first therapist, the one he'd stopped seeing years ago, suggesting I reach out for a professional perspective. She also gave me the name of a neighbor from our old house in Clifton Heights, someone who'd witnessed the relationship between my parents before Mom fled. She begged me not to tell Dad we'd met, and the fear in her eyes was identical to what I'd seen in Mom's. That similarity felt significant. 2 different women separated by years, both expressing the same terror about the same man. The pattern was harder to dismiss than individual allegations. I contacted the therapist, Dr. Helen Price, who was initially reluctant to discuss a former patient. But when I explained I was Dad's daughter trying to determine safety, she agreed to speak generally about patterns she'd observed. She said Dad had attended only 6 sessions before quitting when she'd challenged his narrative about being a victim of Mom's vindictiveness. She'd noted concerning behaviors including his refusal to accept responsibility for relationship problems, his tendency to blame others for his emotional responses, and his attempts to manipulate her into supporting his custody case. She'd documented concerns about potential control issues and recommended continued therapy, but he'd never returned. The neighbor Catherine had mentioned, an elderly woman named Grace Morrison, remembered my parents clearly. She described frequent arguments that escalated to screaming, Mom appearing with bruises she'd tried to hide with makeup, Dad's rage when Mom did anything without his permission. Grace had called police twice for domestic disturbances, but both times Dad had charmed the responding officers, and Mom had been too frightened to press charges. Grace said she'd felt guilty for years about not doing more, about not being a better witness when Mom needed testimony. She offered to provide a statement now if it would help, testimony that might support Mom's version of events. Armed with this new information, I met with Detective Vasquez and laid out everything Catherine and the others had shared. The detective listened carefully before revealing she'd been conducting her own background investigation. She'd found 2 other ex-girlfriends from before Dad married Mom, both of whom had restraining orders against him that had been dropped after he'd threatened legal action. She'd found police reports from neighbors in Clifton Heights describing his volatile temper. She'd found evidence that several of his missing person reports about me had contained false information designed to trigger Amber Alerts that weren't legally justified. The pattern Detective Vasquez was uncovering suggested systematic manipulation and control, masked by respectable appearances. Detective Vasquez explained that this new evidence changed her assessment of the case significantly. While Mom had definitely committed crimes by abducting me and creating false documents, those crimes appeared to have been motivated by legitimate fear rather than vindictiveness. The detective was recommending the prosecutor consider extreme emotional distress as a mitigating factor. possibly reducing charges or offering a plea deal that avoided prison time. She was also recommending that I avoid unsupervised contact with Dad until the investigation was complete, and that Catherine be offered protective resources if she chose to leave her marriage. I went to see Mom at our apartment, showing up without warning and finding her sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by legal documents. She looked up when I entered, and her expression cycled through hope and fear before settling on cautious neutrality. I told her I'd spoken with Catherine and others, that I was starting to understand why she'd run. Mom's face crumpled and she started sobbing, these deep, painful sounds that came from somewhere wounded and desperate. She said she'd been terrified I'd choose to believe Dad, that I'd see her as the villain, that she'd lose me permanently after everything she'd sacrificed to keep me safe. I sat across from her and took her hand, feeling the calluses from years of manual labor jobs she'd worked to support us. I said I understood her choices better now, but I was still angry about the lies and the lost relationships with extended family who might have been safe. I told her I needed her to be completely honest going forward. No more fabrications or manipulations, no matter how well-intentioned. She promised transparency, her voice thick with tears and relief. We sat together in the kitchen where she'd confessed everything weeks ago, and slowly began rebuilding trust on a foundation of difficult truths rather than protective lies. Dad continued reaching out through Detective Vasquez, his messages becoming more insistent as I stopped responding. He demanded to know why I was avoiding him, accused Mom of poisoning me against him, threatened legal action to force contact. The escalating aggression in his communications validated everything Mom and Catherine had described, showing the mask slipping as he lost control of the narrative. Detective Vasquez documented everything carefully, building evidence for whatever legal proceedings might follow. Catherine left her marriage 2 months after our meeting, taking her sons and moving to a women's shelter while she filed for divorce. Dad's response was explosive, exactly as she'd predicted. He hired aggressive lawyers and filed for full custody, made allegations about her mental fitness, tried to freeze her access to money. But this time she had documentation and witnesses, including testimony from Detective Vasquez about his pattern of behavior. The court granted Catherine temporary primary custody with supervised visitation, and Dad's carefully constructed reputation began publicly crumbling as more people came forward with stories of his manipulation and control. The prosecutor offered Mom a plea deal, guilty to custodial interference with a suspended sentence, probation, and mandatory counseling. The deal acknowledged that while her actions were illegal, they were motivated by circumstances the system had failed to address appropriately. Mom accepted immediately, relieved to avoid prison and grateful that the legal system was finally recognizing the context of her choices. Part of the deal required her to facilitate my relationship with Dad if I chose to pursue one, but with the understanding that my autonomy as an adult superseded any parental rights he might claim. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.